The forest was still when the first burst cut through it. Not loud, not dramatic, not the heavy thump of mortars or the rolling concussion of artillery. It was sharper, faster, a tearing sound, like metal teeth ripping through dry wood. American infantrymen of the 9th Division were moving along a narrow logging road east of Schmidt. The fog hung low, brushing their helmets like wet cloth. The trees rose in tight columns around them, straight, tall, and close enough to block the horizon. In that kind of terrain, sound became the only advance warning. Footsteps carried, voices echoed. But the sound that came next moved differently. A single German machine gun started firing from the ridge above them. Not an American gun. Not British. The pitch was unmistakable. Short, violent bursts. 12 rounds per second. A saw-like whine that seemed to vibrate through the air instead of punching through it. Staff Sergeant Frank Mallon dropped to the mud. He pressed his cheek against the wet ground. He listened, because sometimes, in the first seconds of contact, listening mattered more than shooting. He heard the rifle cracks of German Mausers. That part was familiar, predictable. But the other sound, the fast one, was different. His platoon knew it. The Germans knew it. Everyone in the forest knew it. The MG-42. But the Germans on the ridge knew something else. When the Americans replied, when their own guns opened up, when belts of 30-06 ammunition ripped through the barrels of Browning machine guns, another sound joined the forest. A deeper buzz. A controlled roar. A steady, relentless spinning blade rhythm that rolled through the trees like machinery coming alive. German soldiers had their own name for it. They whispered it in dugouts. They muttered it after ambushes. They cursed it when they heard it on the wind. Kreissägermacher, Buzzsaw Makers. Not because the Americans carried saws, but because when U.S. machine gunners fired back, they answered Germany's most feared rapid-fire weapon with a sound that felt like defiance. Above the ridge, a German corporal crawled behind a fallen spruce. He had served on the Eastern Front. He had heard the MG-42 slice through the air at 1,200 rounds per minute. He believed nothing could match it. But now, pinned under American fire, he heard a new rhythm, slower, heavier, but unnervingly steady. American Browning M1919S and M2 .50 caliber guns spat out rounds that cracked against trees, tore through branches, and punched through the forest floor. The German corporal pressed deeper into the soil. He knew the MG-42 could drown the battlefield in noise. But the American guns, especially the .50 cal, sent something else into the fight. Penetration. Behind a tree root, the corporal muttered to the private beside him. "Buzzsaw Makers," he said. The private nodded. Another burst came in longer this time. They stayed down. On the American side, Mallon lifted his head an inch. He shouted to his gun team, "Set the 30 cal there, 40 yards forward, cover the left." The Browning team dragged the gun into place. They had practiced the motion 100 times. Linked the belt, slammed the cover, charged the handle twice. Barrel hot, tripod grounded, fire. The gunner squeezed the trigger. The muzzle thudded rhythmically, sending a stream of rounds toward the ridge. The Browning did not scream like the MG-42. It hammered. Each burst was a punch, not a shred. But to the men under its fire, the effect was the same. Stay down or die. Another German soldier tried to reposition. He lifted his head just enough to scan for movement. A .50 cal round snapped past his ear, close enough to shear bark from a tree. He ducked again. "Amerikanische Kreissäge," he muttered. The American buzzsaw. He knew it wasn't a saw. He knew it was a machine gun. But the name stuck, because the sound stayed in the mind, the way fear does, sharp, involuntary, unforgettable. The firefight lasted 8 minutes. 8 minutes of mud, smoke, splinters, and steel. 8 minutes where survival depended on inches, not bravery. When the firing slowed, Mallon crawled beside the Browning gunner. He tapped his boot. "You kept them from flanking," he said. The gunner nodded. His hands shook slightly. Not fear. Adrenaline. Around them, the forest settled again. The smoke thinned. The steam from spent barrels drifted upward. In the pauses between echoes, the Americans heard only the wind. But for the Germans on the ridge, the last sound in their memory was the buzz-like rhythm of American fire. It stayed with them. It appeared in captured diaries. It appeared in interrogations. It appeared in field notes, taken from abandoned foxholes. Why? Because to the German soldier, the American machine gun wasn't just a gun. It was a signal, a message, a warning that the Americans could match the firepower of the Reich's most feared weapon with something simpler, sturdier, and above all, relentless. The Americans never called themselves Buzzsaw Makers. They didn't need to. The name belonged to the men who heard the guns from the receiving end. The MG-42 was legendary for its speed. The Browning was legendary for its endurance. And the men operating them turned those traits into myths. The German nickname was simply the battlefield's way of recognizing a truth. American gunners fought with machines that didn't stop. And that mattered. It mattered in the Hürtgen Forest. It mattered at Omaha Beach. It mattered on the Siegfried Line. It mattered wherever German and American infantry met at close range. The American guns were not elegant. They were not the fastest. They were not the newest. But they had two qualities German infantry respected and feared. They always worked, and they always kept firing. This was why the German phrase stayed alive in the war's oral history. Because a name like Buzzsaw Makers did not come from admiration. It came from experience. And experience leaves marks. The guns themselves told their own story. The MG-42, built by the Germans to industrial perfection, fired at more than 1,200 rounds per minute. Its barrel glowed red within seconds. Its sound, often described as tearing cloth or ripping metal, came from the frequency of its bursts, not its volume. It was terrifying because it was fast, too fast for the human mind to distinguish individual shots. The Americans heard it. They felt it. They respected it. But the Americans answered with a different philosophy. Their primary infantry machine gun, the Browning M1919A4, fired at a much slower rate between 400 and 600 rounds per minute. It didn't shred. It hammered. It didn't overheat as quickly. It could fire belt after belt, hour after hour, if the gunner kept the barrel from glowing too hot to handle. And then there was the M2 Browning, 50 caliber. The weapon German soldiers feared even more. It fired half-inch rounds at 2,900 feet per second rounds that could tear through armor plates, concrete corners, and most battlefield cover. It was technically an anti-materiel gun. The Americans used it anyway against trucks, against bunkers, against anything that moved, and against anything that did not move fast enough. To the Germans in the field, the 50 cal was not just a machine gun. It was a force of nature. The Germans had heavy weapons capable of overpowering American fire tripod-mounted MG-42 seconds, MG-34 seconds, and the deadly 20mm flake guns when used in ground mode. But these required setups, positions, and crews. The American 50 cal could be mounted on tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, and in some cases fired directly from the shoulder brace of a determined infantryman. The Germans learned quickly. If you heard the deep rhythm of a 50 cal, it meant your cover wasn't cover anymore. Trees splintered. Sandbags erupted. Brick walls showed daylight. Steel plates bent. That was why the Germans used the nickname, not because it sounded dramatic, but because from their perspective, American guns tore the battlefield apart the way a buzzsaw tore through lumber. Not fast, like an MG-42, but devastating, consistent, unstoppable once it started. Captured German infantrymen described it in interrogation transcripts. It buzzed, but deeper, like a saw biting into wood. It felt like the Americans were cutting the forest down around us. It did not stop. Even our MG-42 had to pause. Theirs, never. The fear was compounded by American fire discipline. American gunners were trained to fire in bursts, not to conserve ammunition, but to maintain control, to keep barrels from overheating, and to correct aim between bursts. German gunners often fired longer bursts because their guns were designed for blistering suppression. 2 philosophies, 2 rhythms, both deadly. But only one earned a nickname from the enemy. The Germans rarely named the British Bren. They rarely named the Soviet DP-28. They did name the American guns because they kept hearing them, and the sound stayed with them. For the American gunners themselves, the nickname never reached the front line. They did not call themselves anything special. They focused on fundamentals, setting up tripods under fire, keeping belts clean in mud, changing barrels with gloves because the heat could sear skin off in seconds. In after-action reports, American platoon leaders noted that machine gun teams were often the first targeted by German snipers. The Germans knew, silence the American guns, and the assault slowed. The U.S. infantry relied heavily on suppressive fire. Their doctrine emphasized coordinated movement behind machine gun cover. Without those guns, rifle squads became vulnerable. The machine gunner's experience was one of pressure. Pressure to set up quickly. Pressure to keep firing. Pressure to protect the men advancing behind them. Gunners like Malin remembered the smell most clearly. The mix of oil, burned powder, and hot metal. They remembered the weight of the guns. They remembered the fatigue afterward as their firing hands trembled from vibrations. But above all, they remembered the noise. To the gunner, the sound was not a weapon. It was a responsibility. To the enemy, the sound was a threat. To the gunner, it was a promise. We will keep firing until you are safe. This psychological divide is a constant in warfare. The same sound creates fear in one mind and focus in another. German soldiers approached the sound differently. They associated the Browning's steady buzz with an American presence that could not easily be dislodged. American fire often broke German assaults before they reached effective rifle range. In forest fighting, where visibility collapsed and ambushes unfolded at brutal distances, machine gun fire determined whether a squad lived or died in the first 30 seconds. The nickname Buzzsaw Makers reflected more than acoustics. It reflected battlefield impact, and soldiers name what they fear. Strategically, the nickname underscores something larger: the industrial backbone behind American firepower. The United States did not enter the war with the fastest guns, or the most elegant, or the most advanced. But they entered with reliability, with manufacturing consistency, with logistics that ensured every gun had belts, barrels, and parts, even on the worst days. A machine gun is only as deadly as its supply chain. The Americans understood that. The Germans, late in the war, learned it. The MG-42 could fire faster, but it consumed ammunition at a rate the increasingly strained German logistics system could not sustain. It needed frequent barrel changes. It needed precision-machined parts that became harder to produce under Allied bombing. The Browning guns needed almost nothing. They tolerated dirt. They tolerated cold. They tolerated inexperienced hands. American strategy favored what could survive, not what looked impressive on paper. And the battlefield reflected that philosophy. When the Germans heard the deep, rhythmic American fire, they were not just hearing a gun, they were hearing the output of a supply system that could keep that gun firing indefinitely. This was the true reason behind the nickname. American fire did not fade. Even when pushed, even when pressured, even when exhausted, the guns kept firing. And the Germans remembered. In the end, the nickname survived long after the war. It appeared in memoirs, it appeared in interviews, it appeared in letters home. But it survives for one reason: because it was honest. The Germans feared the sound because it meant danger. They respected it because it meant discipline. They repeated it because it captured their experience. American gunners never asked for a title. They never knew they had one. They were too busy doing their job, firing, covering, advancing, surviving. The battlefield remembers sounds long after the smoke clears. Some sounds fade. Some linger. The buzz of American machine gun fire, heavy, relentless, unbroken, lingered. It was not the fastest fire. It was not the loudest fire. But it was the fire that did not stop. And war has a simple rule. The sound that does not stop is the sound that stays.